Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra. universally to all, so that we together with all beings realize the Buddha way. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha, Prajna, Paramita. Check, check. Can you hear me? Thank you.
Mic check, mic check.
Give him a good mic. Really? I thought we had problems on it. One of the lavaliers was not working.
Mic check, mic check.
Testing. Can you hear me online?
Hey, Bill, can you hear this?
Mayhew? Got it.
How about this one, Bill? You hear me?
If Ungon can hear us, everybody can hear us. Do a mic test, Mike.
1, 2. You got me? Thanks.
You could sit right in the middle if you, Laurel. You're one of those behind the stage guys.
Great face for the radio.
I think you have a great face. I always thought you were Chinese when I first met you. You got the little Fu Manchu going there. Yeah, I can see everything. I can see it. They can see it. Sure. Let me introduce you again to Shinjen Mike Goldman. He is our senior priest here at Atlanta Soto Zen Center. And he was giving a series of talks over a year, right? about a year and a half on the history and little quirks and dead ends and side alleys that came about in the history of transmission of Zen, which I thought was fascinating. And now he's going to make a little bit of a switch, but today Mike said he thought he would do a little bit of a summary overview and maybe launch into a new approach to sharing some of those teachers' teachings with us more directly rather than emphasis on the history. So with no further ado, turn it over to Shinjin.
Okay, well, for everybody that's been here for the last year and a half, we did a series, the Ancestors Talks have been a series on the history of Buddhism and kind of focusing on the lineage of Soto Zen. Can you hear me now? You got me now? Bill? Okay, good. All right. Focusing on the history of Soto Zen and our lineage. How did we get here and who was responsible for making that happen? And I think one of the most interesting things is that a lot of these things were like almost, you could say, political answers to theological questions. You had a lot of watershed moments in Buddhism that happened more because of political or military events than philosophical developments. So when we got up to the modern period in Japan of Soto Zen, I thought that was a good stopping point and kind of the reset, go back to the beginning. But I didn't want to just start over and do the history a second time. I didn't think there was a lot of value to doing that a second time, and I didn't think I had a lot to learn by doing it a second time myself. So what I thought I would do was reset, go back to the beginning, and start with the writings themselves, and start with the literature of Buddhism, and how did that plug into the history, and how did that change, and how did Buddhism evolve, and how people wrote different things down. And so I thought I would start with the Jataka tales, which are absolutely fascinating and some of the earliest writings in Buddhism that we have. But once I started researching the Jataka tales, this one question that kept coming up when we were talking about the history kept coming back to me. And the question was, why are we bothering with history of Buddhism now? And that question kind of bounced around in my head for a while. And I thought, well, let's apply that to this. Why do we want to bother with the literature? So I thought, instead of just lecturing on the Jataka tales, I thought we would start off with this new variant on the series and kind of take the pulse of everybody that was here, and kind of so I could kind of read the room and just kind of have more of a discussion of the importance of the literature and what we think we could gain from it. So a couple of things to put us all on the same page. The practice of Zen, I think we would all agree, is based more on the direct experience of the individual. You know, that's kind of what we all attempt to do when we sit in Zazen, is gain direct experience and derive meaning from it. So with that said, that kind of puts the writings in way sort of in the background for us, or we can assume that's true. And direct experience in a lot of ways can't be really compressed into writing. The Buddha was very clear that words are going to fail when you try to do that. He spent the next 50 years after his enlightenment experience trying to explain what he had been through. So language itself is kind of going to fail us. I love that quote. It's always been attributed to Thelonious Monk, but there's some disagreements on who actually said it. But I think it applies to Zen as well in some ways. He said that writing about music was about like dancing about architecture. And I happen to think dancing about architecture is a pretty interesting concept. I'd like to go try it sometime. But So there's this idea that writing about this direct experience is going to miss the mark no matter how hard we try. And we've had some of the most brilliant minds in human history attempt this. And so we've got, probably various degrees of success in there. The writings of Buddhism really didn't take place for quite a while after the Buddha taught. The Buddha didn't write any of this down himself. What we understand is that for roughly 400 years, before any of this was written down, his teachings were turned into chants and repeated by the monks. And when you go back to those original chants, it's interesting because they're loaded with these mnemonic devices, so that everybody can remember them. Thus it is written, thus I have heard, the science, on and on and on. So you'd be able to remember each one of these. And allegedly, the original language was in Pali. But I started to find some historical references that said that the Buddha himself probably didn't speak Pali. It was probably an older variant of Indian language. But the original chants that we know of were in Pali. Pali is a dead language. It's no longer used even in India. And from there it went to Sanskrit, and a lot of the literature is originally written in Sanskrit, then translated into Chinese, then in our lineage translated from Chinese to Japanese, and then finally to English. So we've got this enormous game of telephone. And so how accurate these translations are is really up for debate. So we've got the original issue of language isn't going to really be able to encapsulate these ideas to start with, to 400 years of oral tradition, and then across several different languages. And one thing we know from looking at the history is, cultures aren't static. Cultures change, ideas change, values change. So what was important to the original monks may have been drastically different 600 years later when these things became written ideas.
The trays, trays.
So that's something to keep in mind when we look at the literature. With the Jataka tales themselves, and we'll go deeper into the Jataka tales next month when we really start diving into the literature. One of the things that becomes really obvious really quick is that a lot of these were based on older Hindu traditions and older Hindu stories that got adopted into Buddhism. So we've got a lot of influence from other cultures as well. And one of the things to keep in mind, even though Soto Zen values the direct experience above everything else, that's really what we're here to do, is to have this direct experience and insight. Not every school of Buddhism is like that. So different schools of Buddhism put different amounts of emphasis on the different teachings and the different writings. But I think when we go back to the very basic, we really have Ananda to thank for most of this, because Ananda, one of the Buddha's original followings, was blessed with a photographic memory and remembered all of the Buddha's teachings word for word and turned them into the original chants. So that's where the whole thing starts. But as we fast forward and as we go through this and we look at the history in terms of the writing, what we're going to find is that the body of the Buddhist texts are divided into what are called the three baskets. And I'll read this section out of the introduction to the Jataka tales. These are the Vinaya Patitika, or the rules for monks, the Abhidhamma Patika, or the higher philosophy, or the Sutta Patika, texts concerning particular occasions and incidents where the teachings of the Buddha were given. Okay, so that's, and then they get further divided into the four Nikayas of middle length or long length, or the gradual sutras arranged by number, and the connected sutras. Okay, so already we're wading into a great big confusing mess. And we'll see as we go through some of these early sutras, it is really difficult to be on top of what these guys are trying to tell us. I mean, it was a very different way to use language just to start with. So when we look at the three baskets, this is kind of interesting. Stories, mainly of the Buddhas and of the patriarchs, various bodhisattvas. And one of the things that's really interesting is at this place in time, this part of the world, the literacy rate was about 3%. So about 3% of the population was able to read and write. That's not much. And it wasn't that they were lacking brain power, it just was not that important. We're talking about very rural economies, very rural populations, and the written word just wasn't really how they governed their lives and how they got information from one person to another. So these periods, and this is something that's pretty common throughout the world at this time and at this rate of literacy, that one form of entertainment was that everybody gather around the one guy that could read. So that's where a lot of these original stories and original sutras came from, and that's what their original purpose was. Or not their sole purpose for entertainment, but a group of people would gather around the one guy that could read. And there's this really great quote by the Freudian novelist Terry Crews. He talked about his childhood, no TV, no radio, and he said everything was stories and stories were everything. And the human brain does something really interesting with stories, especially when you're talking about a biography. I don't know if you're familiar with the theories of Joseph Campbell, but Joseph Campbell came up with this idea of the hero cycle and the hero's journey. And he said that this is common from culture to culture, that one of the things that makes us human is our need and our ability to do this to a story of someone else's life. So the hero cycle, one of the things that happens is that the circumstances of the hero's birth are unusual. And the hero shows a great amount of ability at an early age. And then the hero has to go on a journey or an odyssey of some sort, essentially for the well-being of his people, of his tribe, or of humanity in general. And he visits the underworld of some sort. He goes through a lot of trials, visits this underworld, gets the things that he's going to need to help everyone else. And then he goes back to society, rejoins society, but he's been through this transformation, and he has information that's going to make other people's lives better, and does so. And then when he passes, we're given the promise that our hero will come back when we need him the most. And there's something about human psychology, us as a species, that will take any biographical story and start plugging those items into it. And when we look at it in those kinds of terms, we've essentially got the life of the Buddha staring right at us. Okay? I mean, think about it. When he's born, circumstances were really unusual. Every flower on the planet bloomed. He was born out of his mother's side. He could walk and speak immediately. We've heard this story thousands of times. He walked in the four cardinal directions, points at the sky, points at the ground, and says, "I alone to save the world." That's pretty unusual birth.
It's not unusual in politics anymore.
Yeah, but that idea, it goes from culture to culture to culture, all over the planet. I mean, you could pick any of these great mythic heroes, and you could plug these items of the story into it. And the Buddha went through his own, what we could call a night sea journey. His quest, he leaves the palace somewhere in his late 20s, leaves his wife and his child, wanders around in the woods, going from teacher to teacher. None of them can help him out. And then he has this, in some ways, very terrifying event that led up to his enlightenment. He had to essentially go one-to-one with the Hindu version of the devil. And after that, went back to the monks and delivered the lecture at Deer Park. So he brought this gift back to humanity. And we were told that when the teachings die away and we need them the most, Maitreya, the next Buddha, will appear to teach again, to go through this all again. But pick any mythic hero, and they go through that exact cycle. So that's kind of what we're looking at in the stories. Whatever needs, psychological needs, these groups of people had, they plugged these aspects of the story. Were any of them historically true? Probably not. I don't know of any other babies that could walk and talk at birth. Those kinds of weird things just don't happen. But this wonderful idea of when we need these teachings the worst and they've faded from the world, that somebody will come back to teach them again. That's kind of interesting. And one of the things I've always wondered, that 7 years when he wandered, he left the palace and before his enlightenment, you kind of have to wonder if that was really all ascetic training and all very serious work. I kind of envision at least part of it to be a Kerouac romp throughout the Indian countryside. Because two other things that are, I think, true, besides the Campbell hero cycle, is all cultures have their version of On the Road, and all cultures have their own version of Elvis Presley. So, what's it? And Manson. Well, yeah, every culture has a monster. So that's what we'll be looking at with the stories, and we'll start next month with the Jataka tales, and they are really fascinating. Some of them are really strange, but they're a lot of fun. So next is the Sutras, and the Sutras is taken from the Sanskrit word for a thread. And this is where we get to the main ideas of the teachings. And there's thousands of them, thousands of sutras out there. And as they archaeologists keep working in Central Asia and in China, they keep finding more and more sutras. So can all of this really be attributed to the direct teachings of the Buddha? Probably not. And the historicity of some of them is always going to be up for question. The Lankavatara Sutra, which is the sutra that Bodhidharma brought to China with him and told his original followers, everything you need to know is in here. Well, you read the introduction of that, and it says that the Buddha went to Sri Lanka and taught. Probably not very historically likely that actually happened, but we've got a lot of amazing things in that sutra, and we'll get to that one as well. And there's a huge difference in the original Indian teachings, and we'll go through some of those, than the teachings that came much later during the Chinese period. Around 500 to 700 in China, there was an explosion of writing. And these are the sutras that in Soto Zen that are the ones that we spend the most time with. Mainly the Great Heart of Perfect Wisdom that we just chanted a few minutes ago that Lindy did a wonderful job leading us through. That first starts turning up around 715, the oldest copies of it. So not only did Buddhism undergo a radical change in philosophy around this time, from 500 to 700 in China, but the way it was written down and the way it was presented. So, we're probably looking at things that we're paraphrasing for the Indian teachings, and we're probably looking at things that were original ideas to the Chinese. So, those writings are pretty different. The one that stands out, and we'll spend some time on this one, is the Platform Sutra. Because the Platform Sutra is the only one of the major sutras that flat out tells you this is not the teachings of the Buddha, this is the story and the teachings of Huineng. And it kind of ends the period of written sutras. So that one really kind of stands alone. So that one kind of throws in to relief kind of one of the questions I'm asking you guys here is the importance of the writings. Huineng was illiterate, or allegedly illiterate, but the story that we're given is he was instantaneously enlightened when he heard somebody chanting the Diamond Cutter Sutra, having never read sutras before. So there's a couple ways to look at it. Maybe the sutra was so important that hearing these words were what causes enlightenment, or maybe the fact that he knew nothing about sutras at all and was enlightened anyway. So there's a couple of different ways to interpret that. But the interesting thing to always keep in mind about Huineng and about the story of his enlightenment is that after Huineng passed and transmitted, the Southern school became the predominant form of Buddhism in China. And the Southern school, one of their big philosophical differences between the sort of the Southern and Northern school was Southern school believed that enlightenment could happen instantaneously. So they're the ones that got to tell the story, and they tell the story of their hero is becoming instantaneously enlightened, having no knowledge of the writings. So had the Northern school prevailed, you may not have the story of Huineng told this way. So that's something to keep in mind about all these sutras. Once again, we're going to be contending with, political answers to theological questions and theological answers to political questions. These things were written for a reason, but there's history and other ideas behind it. And the last one of the groups of writing is the instructions for monks. And this was there since the very beginning. A lot of the Buddha's original discourses were the rules for monks. And we go to Dogen, and his writings, you can stack them up and they'd be about that high, and about 80% is rules for monks and directions on how to sit. Very little philosophy in there. So that's kind of interesting. And one of the things I think that's most interesting about this group of writings, and I'll be the first to admit I have not plowed through all of it, but is we're going to get to see how Buddhism changes over a long period of time, because you're going to have very different strategies and tactics for managing these ideas when you've got itinerant monks that are living in the woods and begging for a living than you're going to have when you've got large temple complexes with standing armies. Okay, so you're going to have to change. The philosophy is going to change. The rules are going to change. And that's going to be something to keep in mind when we look at the history of these writings. So what I would like to discuss with everybody and get everybody's feelings on and see where you're at is in terms of the writings these themselves. How important are they to us now? What's the meaning there for us now? I think back a lot of times to teaching beginners, and one of the things that's interesting about teaching beginners, and I don't want to make a big deal out of gender, but you typically when you're talking, when you have women beginners, one of the things they'll say is that, I'm here to learn how to center myself. I've been through these tumultuous events, and I want to learn how to center myself. And young guys almost always start with, well, I read this, and that set me on a path to be here. And it's something like the Suzuki essays, or Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, or Beginner's Mind, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. But it's interesting that I notice that a big chunk of the people that come here, they come here because they read something. They started reading something. And I think that even in my own case, I think the seed was planted to become a Buddhist because I got so heavily into reading the beat writers, Kerouac and Cassidy and Ginsberg, and people like that when I was a teenager. And none of them were great practitioners of Buddhism, but they were all heavily influenced by Buddhism. So that's kind of one of the things that led me here. So knowing that we've got direct experience on one hand which is what we're all looking for, and that's where the deepest meaning of Zen comes from. But we've got this whole body of literature and this whole body of writing. What are we supposed to do with this? And keep in mind that in Japan, in the medieval period, that Soto Zen spread through the commoners, the common class. That's why they refer to it as farmers. So it didn't spread in the cities among intellectuals like Rinzai did. So Soto Zen is not as concerned with things like studying koans, memorizing koans, and memorizing great passages out of the sutras. You know, it goes straight to that direct experience. So it's interesting. I mean, there's probably people here, it's probably different for everybody, and that's what I wanted to talk about. You know, there may be people, I mean, we've all seen or known folks that sit very, very little, but they're here for discussions. So the philosophical ideas are very important to them. And they're probably doing a lot of reading, but not a whole lot of sitting. And then we've got people on the opposite end of the spectrum that sit for hours on end and probably haven't picked up a book and read it in years. I would posit that there's room in Soto Zen for both approaches. But wanted to kind of take the temperature of the room and see whatever everybody else thought about that. So with that, I'll open the floor and leave you with one last aphorism. A donkey loaded down with the most important books ever written is still a donkey.
So first, I don't see any hands on the screen. Let's see if there's anybody in the room. Raise your hand. We'll pass the mic to you. Not that mic, the other mic. Oops. Okay.
And as we go, when everybody speaks, or asks a question or brings up a point, tell me what your favorite book ever written was. Doesn't have to be about Buddhism, it can be fiction, nonfiction, but start with your absolute favorite book.
Mic check. Do you guys hear us?
Okay. Anybody? Comment, question? Come on, come on. Yeah, we're burning energy here. We got one. Please introduce yourself by name as you start.
Can everyone on the screen hear me?
Yeah,
My name is Lee Landenberger. I am my favorite book would have to be today. Might be different tomorrow, but today is a book by the historian William Manchester. It's called The Glory and the Dream, and it's a history of the United States from 1932 to 1972. And the reason it's a favorite of mine is because it opened my eyes to current history and the power of and the arc of human events, and it's been a guide for me ever since. My comment about is there room in Zen practice for not a lot of sitting but a lot of reading, or the opposite. Anytime I come to any crossroads and I need guidance, I think, okay, I've got two options. I can go ask somebody who knows a lot more than I do and see what guidance they give me. Or I could do what they're likely to tell me, which is go sit. And I end up doing a lot of sitting just on my own because that's the way it drives me. And answers tend to come to me. And there's this sort of wrestling match between, well, how much of the Sangha do you include in your thoughts and your decisions and the direction you go? I think everybody probably has a different view of that, a different take on it, and it may even depend on the day that you're, considering something. That every time I come to that crossroads, I think, no matter who I ask, if it's anybody in this room, more than likely, and it's great advice, they're going to say, why don't you go sit on that? And it sounds like a quick way to get out of something or to not be put in a corner, and you can feel pressure. You can pressure people to give you an answer, but I prefer to just sit. And it's something that's gotten easier for me as I get older. I realize sitting is not something that everyone's comfortable with.
I think that's a really good point, because another way to said that just go sit sounds kind of flip. Actually, it's the complete opposite, because what you're really saying is, why don't you go do the most difficult thing you can possibly do? Just sit there.
But I don't want to do that. That sounds hard. However, it's also the most rewarding, for me anyway. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
I'll do it since the mic's in my face, I guess.
There you go.
Mike, you really threw a wrench in the works when you said your favorite book, because I think, like Lee, depends on the time, you know. But I really like Joseph Campbell Companion for a long time, which is actually, you mentioned Joseph Campbell, that's a great nonfiction book. And I sort of judge nonfiction by how much ink I spill into the margins, or how much I underline. So that would be one, and maybe Stepping Into Self-Deception by Rodney Smith for a while. And some other ones too, like nonfiction, like Shantaram, I thought was really, really kind of cool, opened my eyes to India. I don't know, I don't remember books very well, so I read them, and there are probably some other ones, you know, back in the day, Count of Monte Cristo and books like that. But I'm looking forward to the series. You know, I guess that's what you're trying to get feedback for, is more, what are we going to be talking about? And I think some of those older sutras, I'm not familiar with most of them, so I mean, I read a lot of, you know, books with the book club, but we don't go back and study kind of the earlier sutras that are, you know, more part of the Theravadan tradition. You know, they study a lot of that a little bit more than maybe we do. And I'm looking forward to kind of getting some exposure to that, so I don't really have any other feedback other than that, unless you have a question for me.
Not a direct question, but yeah, I think a lot of the reasons that Westerners, Soto Zen or not, really don't spend a lot of time with the earlier Sanskrit literature is because it's really difficult. It's really difficult. I mean, you read a couple of passages, you're like, what is this guy talking about? So yeah, that's gonna be some fun.
Yeah, well, thank you for diving in and taking us with you.
Keeping an eye on the screen, Ungan is indicating we need to speak up a little bit.
Oh, okay, well.
No, it's not a matter of speaking up. When he turns his head away from his microphone to talk to the audience, you lose most of what
Oh,
you're
you're losing you.
Sorry about that.
Now, just don't let it happen again.
I will jump through this screen.
I'm keeping my eye on the screen for hands, so anybody comes up with a, yeah,
Okay, we'll do that.
if you're looking.
Anybody in the room want the mic?
Of course, then you'll turn and talk toward the screen.
I'm gonna put it as close to the middle as I can.
So still keeping an eye out for hands on the screen, so anytime you raise your hand, we'll call on you online. But meanwhile, in the room, anybody else?
Oh, we're going in order.
We're going down the line. If you're calling you out.
I'm Chance. I'm still kind of a beginner here.
Speak up a little bit, please.
My name is Chance. I've been a beginner here. Well, I am a beginner here. And I would say one of my favorite books is, it's actually a fiction book by Michael Crichton called, I think it's The Sphere. It's been a while since I've read it. It's a very interesting book, if anybody's read it. But I think one of the things, coming back to the topic, is, I mean, for me, reading was what turned me on to the Buddhist practice. You know, because it was, you know, like you said, young guy, read something and all of a sudden it just like turns me on, you know, to the whole thing. And I think that's an important aspect, especially for people that are coming into it, that haven't had a whole lot of exposure. I think it's something that can really benefit them once they begin sitting on the cushion. Just because, like, it gives them something to not necessarily like lean on, but something to think about while not thinking, if that makes sense. So.
Hi, my name's Benjamin. I'm fairly new here and to formal practice, although I like to say I've been informally practicing for around 34 years, most of the time just not knowing it. So I guess I'll just say the book that came to mind during the talk today was Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, because you were talking about the Jataka tales and how you were thinking there must be sort of a lost Kerouac Karak type travel for Siddhartha himself, and I think that Aszc kind of imagined a similar thing, if people are familiar with that book. And as far as the role of texts in Zen practice, I think that for me it's a line from Joko Beck's book, Everyday Zen, where she says the danger in talking about the practice is that then the talk about the practice or the reading about the practice can become a mere substitute for the practice itself. So that's kind of where I sit on texts. I'm a voracious reader, and I read far too much and everything else. So this whole trying to let the practice be the practice itself is kind of where I sit for myself.
Thank you. You should know not to ask me this question. It's like saying, what's your favorite song? So it's impossible to land on one thing. And I chuckled when you mentioned Harry Crews, because there's a tattoo on my back that's from the cover of one of his books. But I mean, I love the classics, Les Miserables, anything Dostoyevsky. I really get into things, fiction that transcends time, like The Time Traveler's Wife and Cloud Atlas, those sort of books. Margaret Atwood. Anyhow, I was a Shambhala person for many years, and my practice very much focused on reading, and I still enjoy that today. In fact, Hojo and I are going through a number of Dogen's writings line by line to help with understanding. But since I've been a Zen person, sitting has definitely become the primary practice, and just trying to do reading in smaller bites so that it doesn't become the thing. That's it.
Yeah, and for those of you who are fairly new, Corolla typically goes last. That's how Corolla likes it. So,
I don't
we do too.
I don't have a comment.
Beginning of wisdom.
I'm Abhilasha. It's one of my good books to always come back to. It ranges, like it's probably also comes as kids book, but also for adults. The Little Prince. And I don't know, sometimes when there are just too many things going on, it's just a book that just lets you step back and in a very imaginative way. So I like that one. And then Siddhartha also came to my mind as one of the first ones that I read that made me look more deeply into Buddhism. It was, although, a mixture of both. I thought, I was also going through something, but because I was going through something, I wanted to look for a book that I could read related to Buddhism. So, and then I read about Siddhartha, I read the story, and I was good. In terms of practice and reading, I think after reading Siddhartha, I felt that there is hope, and that made me push more to practice, because sometimes unless you do it, you don't get the result. But if somebody has done it and you read about them, it gives you some kind of hope or a story that, okay, it worked for them or it helped them. So then it makes you relate and inspires you to okay, you can also probably do it. So that's how I relate to reading. Yeah. Thank you.
Last but not least.
This is Laurel. I think probably my most favorite series of books was Asimov's Foundation series. Yeah, I can't. And it's kind of, there's a lot of Buddhism in there, I mean, you got to pick it out, but how...
This is the last refuge of the incompetent.
Right. Yeah. And you can predict the future of herds of people, but you can't predict the future of an individual. So I thought that all just always kind of stuck with me.
So before we get more favorite books online, let's turn the question back on you. What's your favorite book currently?
I'm going to go with Moby Dick. for a couple of reasons. It was packed full of absolutely everything Melville thought.
Yeah.
He really dumped everything that had ever gone through his mind. He dumped into that book, and it's a great look at colonialism, European and American colonialism at the time, and his reasoning for why it didn't have to be that way. And I also interpret the book in a lot of ways as a love letter to Queequeg.
Yeah, quick break.
Yeah, a big chunk of the book I think is really a love letter to Queequeg.
Yeah. Well, I have to admit that I have a favorite book as well. Currently, it's you may not have heard of. It's titled "The Original Frontier," and my second favorite.
800 scroll.
My second favorite is "A Razor Blade of Zen," due out in February 23.
Is it still available? Is it still available?
What?
Your books.
Of course.
Okay. What is
Nobody said the Bible.
Yeah. Okay, so anybody online want to follow up?
Put up a hand. From Michael to everyone, I am taking a course on, can you read that, church history? Chat. I can't read the blue. Oh,
Oh my goodness.
can you change color? Change to black.
I can't change it. I don't know how.
Can you step up and read it, Shinjin?
Is Michael on the?
Yep.
If Michael's on Zoom, why did Michael just read it to us?
Read it to us, Michael.
Yeah, just unmute.
Okay, I was cooking, so I didn't want to have commotion going on while everyone else was talking. But I am currently taking a course in church history, and it started out by asking why one should ever study church history or real theologians, and they give one reason of creativity and informed dialogue. And I think that response is transferable to this kind of question, that the perspectives taken today were not formed out of the empty void, but cultivated through dialogue and contextual response. So that present position isn't necessarily bound by the past, but is so often marked by the past, which you find in other practices like therapeutic practice or a medical practice. And I think it'd be the same for religious endeavor. That, of course, text or knowledge without sitting or action kind of nullifies the knowledge. And I get an example like someone who shames you for littering but won't go pick up the trash off the beach themselves when they see it. But sitting without text feels as if one is cutting oneself off from the historical Sangha that cultivated why we said it all, and may result in misdirected action. That maybe someone knows a more effective way to do what we are practicing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. I think one of the remarks you said I think is really interesting, and we're gonna see this really played out as we go through the literature. In a lot, when you said that anytime you look at religious texts, you're going to find threads of older traditions in there, and one way to look at all of this is that the bedrock of Buddhism itself is Hinduism. And going through the Jataka tales, it's obvious that a lot of these are older Hindu folk tales. They got adopted into Buddhism, but that the bedrock of Zen is actually Taoism. So we see a different set of threads there. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head that theological writings are always going to have to take their political and their historical situation into context. And 1,500 years later, 2,000 years later, a lot of that context may be lost or difficult for us to get to, or something that the layman isn't really going to comprehend. It's something really for a specialist. So, yeah, I think those are really good points, and I wish you luck with this course.
Yeah, thank you. And for the book, I do have a soft spot in my heart for The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. But I think if I had to, pick something that I feel had more impact on me overall, it would probably be No Death, No Fear by Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay. Very cool.
So is everybody talking about their favorite book?
Well, the talk was, because we're on the ancestor talks, we're leaving history and people, and we're going to start to go a series on the literature. And before we dove in, I just wanted to have a discussion on what's the importance of the literature to Zen. If we're seeking direct experience, why do we bother with reading 2,000-year-old stuff? And just to get the conversation going, I said, start your comment or your question with your favorite book.
Oh,
Yeah.
I can recommend Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin.
Mm-hmm.
Terrific book. Hero of a Thousand Faces, Glass Perlenspiel, which I really like better than Siddhartha. And my favorite books, I read murder mysteries mostly, but Matsuoka's writings are, and Shobo Ginzo are, to me, the go-tos.
Okay.
Let me follow on that. There is a fourth book that I'm writing. The publisher has contracted. This won't come out till 2024, but it is Matsuoka's writings, but they're repackaged. And 3 or 4 of us have been working on this for some years. They're repackaged into a reader format, and it's up to about 150 pages, and they're extracts from the Kyosaku and the Mokurai with all of the anecdotal stuff taken out. And they're set up as a reader format where you can easily scan, and they're in categories and things like that. And as I go through there, I'm constantly amazed at all of these teachings that Matsuoka Roshi, his legacy to us, they're in written form. And he is covering so many things in the 1960s that we're still talking about today. It's just a mind blower. It's like he anticipated so much that would happen, and he didn't pull any punches. He talked about politics and Vietnam and the World War II and all of these things. So there'll probably be a second volume. The rest of the talks will accumulate into the second volume, probably a little smaller, more around his social commentaries. But this one is set up on Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and why Soto Zen. And it's all about, his promotion of Soto Zen to the American, and his promotion of America to Japan and so forth. That's more on the historical side. But it was just refreshing to go back through his writings on a very intensive, sort of line-by-line basis and see everything that he had to say and how relevant it is today. As he said, Zen is always contemporary. I think one of the answers to Shinjin's question is those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, that kind of thing. And I find it's very helpful in my position as trying to manage and help keep our ship running here, just to see all the things from Dogen and on forward about all of the comments they had about just the practicality of offering Zen practice. It's very heartening to see that these are known issues. And The Original Frontier is not my favorite book. But it should be yours. Or one of yours. Okay, we have online, it looks like we have Chris. We have Joe.
Yes, hi.
Yes,
Yes, I am new to the group.
welcome.
Thank you. I thought the meditation and talking start at 11, so I just started a little bit late. But I would like to share with you, I have more than one favorite books. But the current book I'm reading right now, I really enjoyed it because it helped bring into my practice. The book name is No Path to Enlightenment. The I Before I Am. Very interesting. The title really caught my eyes. No Path to Enlightenment. It's related to me. Most people sit down, practice meditation, Buddhism. They think about, oh, I would like to liberate, to go to the other side. But actually, and this book say no path to enlightenment, and it's really good. I mean, wonderful book. Exactly, I've been was learning and listen to Dharma, and I know that is true, and you practice and you liberate yourself. But if you set a goal, I'm doing this and that and that and that to get to the point of enlightenment, it's never get there. And but this book is really bring me back to reality. Say I before I am. That's so true, because when you say I am, you put a lot of emotion into you, and you put yourself first than everyone. And when you say I, which is mean whatever it is, it is. Nothing else more than it is. So therefore this book, I just start by a few chapters, but I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Over to you. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Joseph and Janice, Joe Mendez, Chris, anybody? You don't have to say anything. You won't get in trouble if you do. Don't. Joseph, is that you? Are you going to?
I could speak a little bit. Sorry, I'm feeling a little rough today, but Shinjin Sensei, thank you for your wonderful discussion. I'm looking forward to this series of talks. I will have to agree with Corolla that Dostoyevsky is probably one of the greatest, authors. I would probably recommend Brothers Karamazov to anyone's attention if they want a long, heavy, but fun, enjoyable work of great literature. But I was definitely led into more deep practice through the literature, and definitely recently have been looking at the Sutta Pittakata and really enjoying feels like wholesome stories about the Buddha's life. And anyway, I don't know, I've been getting a lot out of that. There's a lot of poetry in it if you're into that, so there's just a lot of verses if you enjoy that sort of thing in the Three Baskets. And particularly there's several strands of kind of linked discourses that are all have these beautiful poems in them. If you're into that, could be interesting. But yeah, I don't know. I was really struck by your description of the Buddha as a culture hero, which I think is obviously the case. But anyway, I don't know. It is fascinating thinking about just the length of time that the oral transmission would have taken place, just hundreds and hundreds of years of people chanting, and how much room is there for small distortions or other things to creep into it. But I mean, obviously, even writing it down doesn't fix it if you're having to translate between languages and do other kind of manipulations. So I think regardless, it's anyway, I don't know. It feels really important to me to have a textual grounding. And I guess I will say this is one thing in the Sutta Pitaka in particular. There's a lot of instruction on meditation and a lot of like careful walking you through, like this is where you start and this is these are the phases that you will progress through. And I don't know, maybe more linear than I think a Zen teachings would have it in some ways, but like there is at least a practice path that's very specific in the most ancient texts that I have at least found like, I don't know, helpful grounding, in the course of sitting.
And which sutra was that again?
In the Sutta Pitaka, so the first of the three baskets, the discourses, and then, it's again a lot of it's in verse, but there's a lot of discussion of the jhanas, the blissful meditations, and sort of how a mendicant flows from one into the other in this sort of linear, stream of kind of gates. And
Anything on that?
I mean, anyway, it has it's like proven helpful for my practice anyway.
Good. Yeah. Well, thanks for your comments. Yeah.
Yeah, we saw your hand, Janice. You want to go?
Yes. Hi. Sorry about that. I had a dog barking pretty loudly. Well, I've recently enjoyed this little enchanting book, Bursting with Lots of Wisdom by this guy named Bill Mayhew. And I think it's titled Ungin's Rill, and I highly recommend it.
Okay, so Joe Mendez, you're left. Chris, I think you're left. Anything to say? Any comment? Okay, anybody else in the room? Ungod.
I have to tell Janice, you'll get 3 extra bonuses for that and some gold stars. Couple comments. First off, favorite books. That's really a difficult one, particularly as old as I am. I've forgotten what my favorite ones were. But if I had to pick one, it'd probably be James Clavell's Shogun. Nothing to do with Zen, but it was such a pleasure reading that. Secondly, I would probably go with Ken Wilber's wrote a book called No Boundary, which has always stuck with me. He was one of the earliest ones I read that seemed to really have it, a real grasp on Zen. And of course, right now I'd go with Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, of course, in deference to Hojo's 2 books. As far as reading stuff, it's almost essential. Our whole educational model, you learn from as soon as you're born how to read, and you. So particularly for beginners, if somebody walks into the Zendo, you almost got to have something for them to read to get their interest. Hopefully they'll progress to the point where they understand the relative value of reading versus practice. I set a rule very early for myself that if I read for 1 hour, I had to sit for 2 hours. Well, it worked for me anyway, I think a little bit.
How did that work out?
Well, it was hard to do. It was really difficult. But, talking about the Platform Sutra, I happen to be rereading that now. That was my first real serious. And Huining in that book cautions people, readers, not to take the words literally, but look for the underlying meanings. And he also focuses a whole lot on the essence of mind, which is completely undefinable. He apologizes for even trying to say that much. But so that's my comments for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I'll have a turn. My favorite book is probably the novel My Name is Asher Lev, which I was given when I was a little boy, and it's the first book I remember moving me to tears when I read it. The copy that I have now, it's actually right here, was left to me by my grandfather, and it was a copy that he had. So that's a special book to me. Also, the collected works of Robert Frost, I have found a lot of solace in. As far as literature, I would say that whether fiction or not, literature is membership, in my opinion. So we read in some sense to connect and to belong, and the more widely we read, the greater a sense, or at least a hope we have, of membership, and that applies to the, as far as I'm concerned, to the, the Zen books that I read, or to literature of the world, or anything else. So, thank you.
What was the first title you mentioned? That first title of that book, your grandfather?
My name is Aszc by Chaim Potok.
So if there's no one else, we can do the 3 bells to close the Dharma dialogue and the closing chant. We forgot to do the opening. My bad. But then we have a few announcements afterwards. I'd like to remind those folks online of some things that are happening here. And we can do the announcements now. It's a little more formal to close the Dharma dialogue first.
So we'll do that.
Things are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. So just a couple of things. I have some online offerings, as some of you know, the fourth Thursday Zen Talk Forum. It's a roundtable. We don't read a book. We just bring whatever we want to bring to that discussion. And we have some spots on that for you to sign up. And these things are online with registration pages. The one I'm most concerned about right now is the conference coming up toward the end of September. It's the very last weekend. It goes into October 1st. And we have had some scuttlebutt online about some of y'all, Ungan and Roger and John Ross, maybe all coming for that and to stay in the, we have an open residency room now where we could probably sleep 2 or 3 people at least in there. So I'd like to get that all confirmed, and anybody wants to follow on that, please send me an email, and I'll copy Brian so he and I can coordinate. He's giving a talk Saturday afternoon. I'm giving a talk Saturday evening, and I think we're trying to make a decision whether we want to do that here or we're going to do that from home, and how much of our participation will be here. And then Sunday, ASCC also hosts the online retreat. The conference itself is 2 weeks later, and so it's into October, and the conference is more like our annual general meeting, and we invite all of you to attend that as well. And I think that's going to be primarily online. There's not much reason for us to do it in person. But that end of the retreat in the last week of September, I'd like to firm that up with you, Angan, and Roger, and the others. Right now you're saying no, so nope, ain't happening.
Well, Yeah, I'm not going to be there for that. We're trying to put together a Zazen Kai on that Saturday where we'll
Okay.
have a group online with you from Jacksonville.
Okay.
Janice is putting that together.
Okay, cool. And then the other thing I want to encourage everybody to look at is the upcoming retreats in October and December. It will be second weekend. And Ungan, if you have a group of people who would want to drive up for one of those, we can move the start day back as far as you want to make it worth your while for the trip. But let's organize that, and we're getting a little close onto October already, but possibly we could have an extended retreat in December, the second week. It's always the second weekend. Anyway, that's it, and thank you very much for your participation today. And April does a much better job of this than I do. And thank you for all your support. We encourage anybody who's not an online supporting member, to go online and support ASCC. And those of you who are outside the Southeast region, if you prefer to support Silent Thunder Order instead, that's understandable. And pays your money, takes your choice. So very wonderful to hear from you all today. Thank you for your patience in listening. Anything else? Anybody has an announcement? Anyone? Okay, nothing's happening other than what I said. Gasho.
Thank you.